in progress. Well, welcome everyone to our 15th interview in our series, Ideas and Lives. It's both a webcast and a podcast. And our website is ideasandlives.org. And today we're very lucky to follow on our Nobel Prize winning interview with a Nobel Prize winner, to interview a Pulitzer Prize winner, friend Dave Shipler, New York Times journalist, author, general commentator, and we're doing it with my buddy Tzvi Bodie of the Bob and Tzvi Show. So say hello, Tzvi, and we can get started.
Well, let me say hello and point out that David, our guest today, is himself a podcaster, right?
That's right, yes.
And
yes,
he has
a friend of mine and I who used to work at NPR, Daniel Zwerdling, do a podcast called Two Reporters. So you can find it on tworeporters.org or any of the podcast sites.
Yeah, and we've listened. So, Dave, we're going to kind of talk as we do about people's lives and their ideas. And we're going to start out with where you started. Where did you grow up, and what was the environment, and your early days, your high school, before you even went to college?
I grew up in a small town called Chatham, New Jersey, which was an all-white, almost all Christian, upper middle class bedroom community outside New York City. It was a great place to grow up as a kid. I mean, in a sense of I knew everybody in my high school. It was a public high school. It was a small school. My mother taught English there, and I enjoyed my childhood a great deal. I had lots of good friends. In fact, our class still is in contact with each other. We're trying to organize a reunion for May to make up for the one that was canceled during COVID. And it was a nice childhood. The disadvantage of it was that it was not diverse, which I didn't quite realize or think about until I left Chatham, New Jersey, and went to college. I went to Dartmouth, which was also not really diverse. It was all male then and almost all white. I think I had in my class, I think there was one Chinese student, Chinese American, two blacks, one of whom was African, one American. And in fact, I never had any conversation about race with any Black person until I interviewed Martin Luther King Jr. when he came to speak there, and I worked for the radio station. So it was quite a sheltered existence in a way. Class-wise, though, I was actually in contact with people who were not upper middle class. I worked on dairy farms in Connecticut when I went to visit my aunt, who lived there, and I got to know and became really good friends with farming families who were definitely not wealthy, certainly were not highly educated, but who were wonderful people, salt of the earth. And I think that my mother made sure that I did have that kind of interaction. She later, when I became a sort of young adult, she said to me that she had raised me to be comfortable in an embassy or a hut. And given my profession in the end, I certainly
Came in
attained that
handy.
comfort at both extremes and everything in between.
Yeah. So how did you get into journalism? What was your major? What were you interested in?
Well, I majored in sociology, and I think the spark that kind of lit the idea of journalism for me was a question that I was asked by an English professor at Dartmouth. I took his course. He taught a great course. It was in creative writing, and you would write something and then you would meet with him once a week and he would read it aloud to you, which can be a devastating experience, especially this professor, Arthur Dewing was his name, because he could convey through inflection exactly what he thought of the sentence he was reading. And if he liked it, then you read it to the class, which was a small group. It was 10 students. And I took the course twice. You could take it more than once if he approved. I learned a lot about writing from him. And also because I worked for the student radio station, he knew I was interested in public issues. So he said to me at one point when I was a senior, have you ever thought of going to journalism school? And I had not. And I did not, by the way, but I had 2 years to go in the Navy. I was in ROTC. I had 2 years that I had to do after graduation. But the idea kind of percolated. And also my parents were divorced, but I was close to my father. He was a journalist. He worked for Time magazine and other Time publications. And his father had been a journalist. He worked as a newspaperman in Boston and upstate New York before he became an Episcopal minister. So I was, I guess, genetically attuned to this idea. Yeah. And so when I was getting out of the Navy 6 months or so before I got out of the Navy, I went around, I was on leave. I went around to some editors and at various publications and television as well, and asked them, the question, should I go to journalism school? The editors who had been to journalism school said, oh yeah, good idea. Those who hadn't said, nah, you don't have to do that. Just try to get a job. So I got a job at the New York Times as what they called it. Well, they called it a news clerk. It was like a copy boy, except you sat down. I actually started as a copy boy running copy. And of course, in those days, there was nothing digital. So it was all on paper, and I ran copy from the teletype to the editors and all of that sort of stuff. I did that for a couple of years.
So wait, explain what a copy boy does.
Well, a copy boy would stand around. You were always on your feet. And if when some reporter was typing, because it was all typewriters, and finished one take, that is one page of a story, the reporter would yell, copy, and then you would go back and you'd get that page and you would take it to the desk. When this was going on deadline, it was a pretty frenetic pace and quite exciting. I remember when Walter Kerr and Clive Barnes, the theater critics for the Times, would come in after an opening at night, and we're trying to make the edition, which was really a tight schedule. They would sit in the back of the room, and you had to practically stand over their shoulder to be ready when they finished a page to run it up to the desk. And then you went to what was called the morgue, which is the file of old clips, and you got files when editors wanted them, and all of that. So it was basically a messenger's job. One of my jobs actually was to take the first edition of the paper to the Daily News building, which was across Manhattan. And because it was a courtesy, you'd send it, you get it to them. And one night I was doing that and carrying a bunch of papers under my arms. And I happened to encounter a couple of sailors who had been on my ship. They were on a different ship that was in New York at the time. And it was really funny. They started to salute me. I said, you don't have to do that anymore. I'm out of the Navy.
Oh, that's right.
Tell us about your Navy experience.
The Navy experience. Well, I was a young officer on a destroyer that was based in Norfolk. We did have some interesting cruises. We went to the Caribbean a few times. We went to the Azores as a backup recovery ship for a space shot in case the capsule had to come down early. They put U.S. Navy ships all around the world for that purpose. We practiced. Luckily, we didn't have to pick anybody up. We went to the Mediterranean and through the Suez Canal in 1966, a year before the war, closed it, down the Red Sea to Madagascar, Ethiopia, and so forth. So it was really, I love that
join the
part.
Navy and see the world.
Yeah, I loved that part. We went to Aden just as the British were leaving. So there were grenades getting thrown around. We had to be a little careful when we went ashore. But I didn't get into combat. It was during the Vietnam War, but our ship didn't go to Vietnam. It did go later after I got off. So it was really touring. And I loved being at sea. I hated the Navy Mickey Mouse and that sort of thing. I didn't like the protocols and, but I really liked being at sea, being underway, and being in charge of the ship. After I had been on the ship for maybe a year, they made me officer of the deck underway, which meant I had control. I was the senior person on watch when we were steaming in formation with lots of other ships around and lots of other merchant traffic coming through. I mean, for example, the Dardanelles, very busy part of the world. And I remember coming up on watch at I think it was the mid-watch at midnight, looking out and seeing a bunch of lights that looked like you were in a city. You couldn't hardly know what was a ship and what wasn't and where they were. It was pretty daunting, but in a way, very exciting, great fun. And I love
you were young. You came to that, and I've always marveled at the fact that although we in the society in general, we don't give young people that much responsibility, but in the military, both in Israel and the United States, young people have tremendous responsibility.
Exactly right, Bob. Exactly right. And it was a great education for me. I felt very awkward being in command of men who were older than me. When I got into the Navy as a commissioned officer, I was 21 years old. I was 21. So it was a very uncomfortable experience in certain respects, but I think I tried to be a smart officer, and the smart officers I observed depended on their older enlisted subordinates. And I had a couple of chief petty officers who were really superb. And so it was a learning experience. It was, I think, also a great advantage in terms of putting me in contact with people who were very different from me. They were different from me racially, although there weren't a lot of blacks in the Navy. Actually, most of the black Americans who were, and there was a draft at the time, went into the military, went into the Army. But there were some on our ship. There were some racial tensions, not acute, but they were there under the surface. A lot of the enlisted people had not finished high school. So I ran a course to help them get their GEDs, which was a very interesting experience to see the academic limits of a lot of the people in the Navy. A lot of the folks in my division got into financial trouble. And when we were in port in Norfolk, these lending representatives of various lending organizations, not really banks, I think they were kind of private lenders, would come aboard and try to get me as the officer to put pressure on my guy to pay up. And a lot of the guys were just not very financially literate. So in a way, that was my first real exposure to what I guess later became my perceptions about poverty. I mean, that is folks who really were having trouble and were struggling managing their own affairs. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting.
You were not the in charge of the ship that you were on, were you?
Only during, no, of course not. I mean, I was a junior officer, and the way it works is that you have watches when you're at sea, and an officer is designated what they call officer of the deck, which means that he is in charge on the bridge, driving the ship basically with a whole kind of bunch of enlisted people, a man on the wheel, the helmsman, a man on the engine order telegraph, a couple of lookouts, a quartermaster who's navigating, people in the combat information center looking at the radar and tracking other ships to keep you informed about possible dangers and so forth, collision and that kind of thing. But when you might have a junior officer under you as well, there might be two of you, but if you're the officer deck, you're in charge, you give the commands and so forth. Now, obviously, if there's anything that might go wrong, you call the captain. And the captain had a sea cabin right after the bridge. and he was there to be summoned. For example, the captain would give you standing night orders. If another ship was going to come within 2 miles, for example, he wanted to be called. And so you would call him, pick up the phone, call him. He would decide whether to come out to the bridge or not. He would give you instructions, change course, whatever. So that's the way it worked.
Now, did
So
that,
you reported to the captain of the ship.
That's
There was
right.
no one else in between.
Not on watches that way. No, there wasn't.
Yeah.
I mean, I started as not the officer of deck, but number 2. So I was subordinate to the officer who might have been, I was an ensign when I started, then a lieutenant junior grade. So, it could be that the officer of deck was a lieutenant, which is equivalent to a captain in the Army and so forth. So that's the way it worked. It was a very clear hierarchy. But at night, in the middle of the night, when you're all alone out at sea, there's no need for the captain to give up his sleep and be out on the bridge unless he wants to look at the stars. We did have a captain, the first captain, who did like to be out on the bridge a lot. And I don't know if it's that he took pleasure in it or he was just nervous about everybody else, but he was up a lot at night, which didn't do him any good, I don't think. He got really tired.
so as you, we're going to come to your, quickly to your evolution as a reporter, but I'm now realizing that as a veteran, when you covered war situations, especially, let's say, in Vietnam, that you had that background. And I don't know whether that did you any good or with some credibility with some of the military people, or?
Well, by the time I got to Vietnam, the U.S. troops had left. It was 1973, summer of 73. So the withdrawal had taken place earlier. So I did not have any contact with U.S. military, except for some of the military attachés and advisors who were there, but not. And elsewhere, in my foreign correspondence, of course, I did talk to military attachés. I think the main advantage of having been in the Navy was not so much that it gave me particular credibility with them, but that it led me to understand the deceptive nature of institutional values, that the bureaucracy. That is, my experience in the Navy showed me how lies are passed up through the chain of command, so that by the time the information gets to the top brass has a very distorted view of the reality at the bottom. There were a couple of occasions on my crummy old ship that was built in 1941 when the captain simply lied. I mean, one of them was when we were out on a big exercise with, there's an international exercise around the East Coast and into the Gulf of Mexico to try to demonstrate how we were repelling or detecting Soviet submarines. And American submarines were playing the role of the Soviet submarines. So we had, our ship was, as I said, a destroyer, and it had 2 main purposes. One was shore bombardment, it had big guns. The other was anti-submarine warfare. It was a very fast ship, it could go 30 some knots. It had sonar. It had a couple of, didn't have nuclear weapons, but it had torpedoes, it had depth charges. It had something called ASROC, which was a torpedo that was on a rocket that you could fire out into, to connect with a submarine that you made contact with. So we were on this exercise. Our sonar went down. Our sonar hadn't worked for a couple of days, but the captain didn't report it. And it was so vital a piece of equipment that you were supposed to report that in what they called a SITREP, situation report, directly to the Pentagon. He didn't report it because at his level, and he was a commander, there's a rank of commander, how his ship performed would determine how much advancement he would make. whether he would make Navy captain or not. And
So were they going to blame him for the sonar?
apparently apparently they did, or at least he felt that they would, even though that would have been completely unjust. We had old equipment. We were not top of the line ship, but he hid that from the Pentagon until during the exercise, we got a call on the radio, and I happened to be on the bridge at the time, from the admiral's ship, who was in charge of the whole task force, ordering, well, first of all, we heard a call from another destroyer that he had a sonar contact. And then we got the call to go out after that contact along with the other destroyer. The captain it was almost comical. The captain got on the horn, the phone down to the sonar room. The sonarman had taken the sonar apart. The parts were all over the deck down there, and they were trying to fix it. And the captain was screaming at them, is that gadget, we called it the gadget, is that gadget fixed yet? And, we're all ahead flank, left full rudder, and we're rolling around, and the parts are sliding all over the deck. And the sonarman said, no, sir, not yet. Well, get that up online. Oh, yeah, we're trying our best. Yes, sir. So finally, the captain had to get on the radio and admit to the admiral that, he said, actually, what he said was, our gadget just went down. Implying it hadn't been down for a couple of days, just went down. So that's the kind of thing. Then he also tried to cheat on a gunnery exercise, but that's also a long story, to try to make the ship look readier than it was. There was actually a computer problem. The computers in those days were mechanical. They had cams and rods, stuff like that, and they would calculate the pitch and angle of the guns based on the range and the direction of the target. And they were all off. I was the gunnery officer at the time. They were all off. And there was something really wrong. And we had a green ensign from another ship observing the exercise. He was supposed to score it. And he had no idea how to score a gunnery exercise. I knew very well how to do it. And there was a factor that you put into the formula for roll and pitch of the ship. That is, the worse the seas, the kind of, you got a handicap, you didn't get judged as badly. So we were shooting out there at a sled, a surface sled being towed by a tug. And it was far away from the tug, but when we fired, one of the rounds went, like between the sled and the tug. It was not exactly the best situation. There was something really wrong. The captain then said to the executive officer after the exercise, he called me down to the bridge. I was up in this gun director. He said, do you think we'll pass? I said, I doubt it, sir. I said, our scores were terrible, but we'll work it out. We'll see. Maybe the roll and pitch factor will give us enough a handicap. So he says to the executive officer who was standing next to him, well, I think we better make sure that roll and pitch factor is big enough. So the XO went running down to the control room.
So we economists call all those things perverse incentives.
Reverse incentives, exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I wouldn't go for it. Actually, I told this ensign, I said, that's not right. We'll put the actual numbers in, and we failed. So after that experience, when I went to the Soviet Union and learned about how their economy worked, the centrally planned economy, the command economy, I understood it because I'd been in the Navy. I understood the lies that were passed up in the Soviet Union through the ranks into the hierarchy, which fooled a lot of the leadership, I think, into thinking things were a lot better than they were. And in fact, I'm just reading now a book by Susan Eisenhower that came out last year about her grandfather during the Cold War, understanding, and here's where a military background really came into good effect, understanding the exaggerations in the media and others in the politics about Soviet capabilities, because he knew, based on intelligence stuff and so forth, that the Soviet Union really was not as formidable militarily as it had appeared. There was no real missile gap. You remember the missile gap?
Yes.
And all that.
I do remember.
It didn't exist. And so that I understood it when I got to the Soviet Union, and I started looking around, and it was all very familiar to me, actually. It took me right back to my days in the Navy.
Wow, so that's a wonderful element. And so let's go back to you were copy boy, and how did you get into the reporter staff?
Well, they had a system where you could write stories for the city desk on your own time. So I was, for a while, I went from copy boy to news assistant on the foreign desk, where I worked for Seymour Topping, who was foreign editor. My job was to come in the morning and look at all the wires and write up a summary of the major news stories of the day so far. But that was a daytime job. And I realized pretty quickly that I couldn't really write stories on my own time if I worked days for the desk. So I asked to be shifted to nighttime. And I worked at night on the city desk. And then during days, I would go out and try to find a story to do and write it and pitch it to the desk. And then I kind of learned the ropes that way, because the editors were very good and they were tough and they would ask questions. And every time you filed a story and they read it and they said, well, how old was this guy? Where did he live? What did he look like? And they would ask you the questions that you should have been asking yourself as you were writing the story. So it was kind of a learning by trial and error to, fill in the blanks before you gave them the story. And of course, then being in the newsroom of the New York Times was a great, university in itself, because you were surrounded by superb reporters, seasoned veteran people who were willing to help you. And then you read what they wrote and you learned by imitation in a way. So ultimately,
this is all related to the learning by doing that we stress.
Exactly, the apprenticeship. Right? It wasn't called that, but it was definitely an apprenticeship program, no question. It wasn't a program. That's too much.
Right.
It wasn't that organized.
An approach.
Yeah. So then James Reston, the columnist in Washington, needed an assistant, and I was asked to go down to Washington to do that. So I did that, and he was really great. He became a real mentor to me. He taught me a great deal. And then ultimately I'm trying to shorten this story, but I got on the city. I was then promoted to the city staff as a reporter, where I was on general assignment first. That meant every day I got a different subject to cover, which was great.
Back in New York.
That was in New York. Yeah. So in 1968, I got on the staff as a reporter, and it was fun. I was all over the city. I think I probably was in every New York neighborhood. And then after I did that for a bit, they put me on the housing beat, which was really good, because housing in New York takes you into not only every neighborhood, but also almost every area of life you can think of, except maybe the arts. I mean, politics, economics, urban planning, drug addiction, crime. I mean, it just was a great education. I think 4 years of doing that on the city staff in New York, I learned at least as much as 4 years in college. And the most amazing thing about it was they were actually paying me to do it. Right. Not a lot, but they were paying me. So I did that for, several, I don't know, quite some years, but I really wanted to go overseas. I also then, they also started a beat called the press coverage. They wanted to cover news organizations, print newspapers mostly, but they were so nervous about anybody writing anything negative about either the New York Times or any other publication. And I wasn't allowed to do opinion pieces. It was just reporting, that it was very confining. And I did not like it at all. For example, at the time, a proposal was made by the editor of the editorial page at the time, John Oakes, in conjunction with a private foundation. I think it was the Century Foundation. I'm not sure about that, to create a National News Council. The National News Council would be a group of citizens, of prominent people, I guess, some journalists perhaps, a private group that would receive complaints from the public about a particular story or kind of coverage. they would examine it, they would hear from all sides, and then they would render an opinion. Now, they would have no power, obviously. It would just be a private organization. But the executive editor, Abe Rosenthal, and the publisher, Punch Sulzberger at the time, both opposed this idea vehemently because they thought it was some kind of a, kind of surreptitious or shadow control of the press. But I thought it was, I didn't have really a strong opinion about it one way or the other, but I thought it was kind of interesting. And there was a news council operating out in the Midwest somewhere, I think Minneapolis, and had been doing it for a few years. So I proposed a story to go out there and write a piece about it. I wrote a memo to the desk. I said, let's go take a look at how it works. Does it work? People happy, unhappy, whatever. And the memo sort of vanished into thin air. I never heard, I didn't hear. I finally went up to one of the editors. I said, what happened to that memo? And he said, it's in the circular file. You're not going to. So that was so I didn't like that beat, obviously, for that kind of reason. But I wanted to go overseas. I really wanted to go overseas. And my wife, Debbie, and I took Russian as a kind of a lark in New York from an old Russian emigre whose father had been an admiral in the Tsar's Navy, actually. He's a really interesting character. And but then the first assignment that came up was like about 6 weeks after we had our first baby, Laura, was for Vietnam. Abe Rosenthal called me and would like to go to Vietnam next June. This was like November or December. He asked me. I said, "Oh, thanks a lot, Abe. I just had this baby." He said, "Well, look," he said, "if I won't go anywhere. I can't take Debbie and the baby." And he said, "I understand that." He said, and he told a story about how he had been offered Pakistan and he couldn't take his family. So he said no. And so they confined him to covering the UN for years. I said, "Oh, so that's what's going to happen to me if I say no to this?" And he said, no, there'll be other opportunities. But it so happened that this was going to be 1973. The Paris Agreement was being negotiated, and it looked as if the war was going to at least wind down, or at least the American involvement would be ending. And as it happened, Debbie's brother, whom you know, Bob, Skip Isaacs, I think you know, right? Do you know him? I don't know, maybe not. Anyway, I thought somehow you had. Anyway, Arnold Isaacs is his name. He worked for the Baltimore Sun, and he was in Vietnam. Although his family was not there. They were in Singapore, but he was in Vietnam. So we consulted with him. Is it safe to come? And with other people, other reporters and so forth. And we decided in the end, yes, we could go. So that's what we did in the summer of 1973. You
had a choice?
Well, it wasn't, I was no longer in the Navy, so I had a choice.
Yeah.
But, as I said, it was, in the back of my mind, there was a concern that if I turned it down, it might be a long time before I got another one. And I don't want not to toot my own horn, but the city editor didn't want me to leave the city desk. I think he liked what I was doing. So he didn't want to, he was a really good guy. I liked him a lot, but he had that propensity to hang on to reporters he liked, even if they wanted to go do something else. So that was a bit of a.
So anyway, you went.
We went, and we all went, and it was fine. Saigon was manageable. It was not, at that time, was not violent. There was no fighting in Saigon. The fighting was all out in the countryside. It continued, obviously, as we all know, after the Americans withdrew. The Vietnamese continued the war. But luckily, there was no appetite for combat coverage anymore. The American troops were gone. The South Vietnamese army didn't really want us trailing along with them. And the interests in the States in terms of the story, I think really had changed to less military stuff and more societal coverage, which is what I was really interested in doing. Of course, you had to cover the war in the sense of, if there was a battle and a province capital fell or something like that, you had to write about that. And there were a lot of stories I did on the war, but usually not from the middle of fighting. I mean, there were a couple of incidents where I got caught in a little bit of a skirmish, so to speak, but I wasn't doing combat coverage per se. I was not embedded with any military units or anything like that.
So okay, so let's keep going because we have a lot to cover. What was your next assignment when you finished?
Well, what was your first major
Well, that's
piece?
a major assignment.
Publication?
First major what, Zvi?
Your first major publication.
Well, wait. First, he's a reporter. What
Yeah.
was your next assignment? After,
My next assignment was Moscow. I was asked by the foreign editor if I would be interested in coming back to New York from Vietnam for 6 months to study at the Russian Institute at Columbia, language, and then also other subjects related to the Soviet Union. I'd always, of course, I said yes. And so we left in January of 1975, 3 months before the fall of South Vietnam, and lived in the city, New York City, for that period of time. And I took courses. I had individual tutoring in Russian, and so did Debbie. And I also took courses in Soviet economics, politics, and history. So that was really a useful background. And it was important to have it when you went to the Soviet Union, because you really could not depend on interpreters there. All the interpreters were hired by the state, essentially. Well, they were hired by the New York Times, but they were cleared, vetted by the state. You couldn't just go out and hire an interpreter who would be independent. And you couldn't take interpreters, Russian citizens into Sakharov's apartment, for example. It would be politically completely impossible for them from their standpoint and from Sakharov's viewpoint. And Sakharov did not speak English, so you needed your Russian to talk to him and so forth. And also the encounters that you had with Russians on an ad hoc basis could be very illuminating, because mostly Russian citizens were not comfortable talking to American correspondents. It was politically dangerous on an ongoing basis. So, but when you happen to sit next to somebody on a plane or on a train, or even in a restaurant, because sometimes they would, if you went into a restaurant alone or with just one other person, they would seat you at a table that had other people. So you'd get into a conversation. And in those settings, people were less guarded and more open. So that was, it was really essential to have Russian. You couldn't work there without it. So that was a lucky break for me. I was really happy to do that. And even though, to be honest, as a reporter, I regretted not being in Saigon at the end of the war. I mean, it was a very intense experience to watch it from a distance and not be there to cover it. So I wish I would have wanted to have been there. But still, having the chance to go to Moscow was great. And we were there for 4 years, and it was just a fascinating experience.
Now, you wrote a book about Russia. You wrote a book about Russia. Was that right?
I wrote a book. Yeah, I wrote a book about Russia. What happened was interesting, and it kind of tells you something about journalism. There was a 3-month newspaper strike while I was in Moscow, a really long strike, during which, of course, the paper wasn't publishing. So there was no breaking news to cover. I mean, there were 2 of us in the bureau, and there was you couldn't write breaking news. We did write some stuff for the news service, the New York Times news service, which was like a wire service that other newspapers used and published pieces, but not much. So I started to think about longer pieces, longer looks at Soviet society. During those 3 months, I had time. So I started to research and report and think about doing something on the coexistence of religion and communism, on juvenile crime, which was secret there. I mean, crime statistics were classified. You couldn't get them, but you could get people's anecdotes, individual anecdotes. I started to think about and research healthcare. Again, the only way you could do stories like this, because the government had a monopoly of information, was to pick up people's own experiences, which they knew, and assemble them like a mosaic, which you hoped eventually would give you a picture of what was going on. I started to think about the tension between individualism and collectivism in that society. I started to think about the attitudes of Russians toward the West and the ambivalence that many people felt about the West, because there was a craving for Western artifacts like jeans, calendars, stuff like that, because people couldn't leave, they couldn't go travel. So there was kind of an infatuation with the West. At the same time, there was an aversion to the West. There was, in the economic sphere, there was actually a deeply embedded morality against private enterprise and capitalism. I remember when our kids, we lived in a compound, because all foreigners had to live in these compounds. We lived in a building that had a little courtyard. And I remember our kids set up a lemonade stand once, and the Soviet employees of this building were absolutely scandalized. You're teaching your kids how to make money? This is deeply immoral. So I wanted to explore that question, because at the same time that was going on at one level, on another level, there was a great deal of individual acquisition by Soviet citizens, a kind of very utilitarian set of friendships and relationships where, there were these enclaves of privilege. So certain people had access to certain goods and certain services that other people didn't. If you were a writer, a member of the Writers Union, you could get books that were not available in bookstores. If you were in the theater or were a musician, you could get tickets to plays or concerts that could not be obtained by ordinary citizens. If you were a doctor, you could get medicine that could not be obtained by the member of the Writers Union, but the Writers Union could give you the book you wanted and the doctor would give you the medicine, and so forth and so on. And in other classes, if you were if you worked in a fruit and vegetable store, you could put all this produce under the counter and give it or sell it to your friends. Now, Natan Sharansky told a great story, because he was a really good friend of mine. And he is a good friend of mine. And he and a few other refuseniks were arrested once for a little demonstration that they were putting on. They were put in a kind of a sobering up tank for a few days, in which he met this guy who worked in a fruit and vegetable store, all state owned, So they became chums. And this guy said, look, when you get out, bring your friends around. I'll get you the best stuff, the best, vegetables and stuff. So for a while, Sharansky and other refuseniks had better food than anybody else could get, unless you were a Communist Party member. Anyway, the point here is that those 3 months when I had time to see the Soviet Union, not through the framework of a 700-word news story or even a 1,000-word feature, but through the framework of broader, deeper, more searching issues, was transformative for me in the way I understood the society. And during that time, I wrote the introduction to what became my book. It was really off the top of my head. It was kind of a searching, I don't know how much the book published version resembles what I wrote originally, but I put my thoughts down that way. And it told me a lot about, that's where the book came out of, really. But it told me a lot about about journalism and writing, and explained a lot to me, and still explains a lot to me, about the defects the beauties and the defects of journalism. The medium is the message, as McLuhan said, because when you are looking through a particular lens that is shaped by the final form, the final result, or the construct, things look a certain way, and they don't look the same way when you have a different lens. So anyway, so the book, though, I wrote in Israel. I mean, I didn't have time. The paper went back and started publishing. I became the bureau chief. Actually, maybe I'm trying to think when that was, 78. No, I was already the bureau chief when the strike happened. But I was busy. I was really busy and never had a chance to do anything on the book until I got to Israel. And I would work at night and early mornings and weekends, and when there wasn't a lot of news. But of course, as you know, Israel's a busy place news-wise. Luckily, when I arrived in Israel in 1979, things were relatively quiet. I mean, yeah. So I did have time, but it took me a long time, and I was about one chapter short of finishing the Russia book when the 82 war in Lebanon broke out. Mm-hmm. And then I put it aside for 6 months. So you can see how long it took me to do this, from 1979 to 1982. And one of the problems too was that to do the book on Russia, which is really about society there, and it's not so much about politics. It's, I've tried to get the feel of the place into the book. It took me an hour or so at the typewriter, it was a typewriter those days, before I could get my mind back into Russia. I mean, Israel is like a different place, to say the least. So it was a mental exercise. It was a very slow process.
There were a moderate number of Russians in Israel at the time.
A few, including a few we had known in Moscow as good friends, who had managed to finally get their exit visas and
Didn't
emigrate.
Natan Sharansky get out?
No, he was in prison at that point. He was arrested in 1970. Well, he was arrested in 77, I think, and tried in 1978 in Moscow. I covered his trial by standing outside because they wouldn't let us in, and talking to Leonid Sharansky, his brother, who was a great guy who was allowed in. Even Sharansky's mother wasn't allowed in because she was a witness. And so that was, it was quite an emotional experience, actually, which I can talk about in a bit if you'd like. But so he was arrested and jailed for, I think he got more than a 10-year sentence, and then was released in a prisoner exchange where I think the U.S. released a couple of spies. I mean, the Soviets tried to make him out to be a spy. They were trying to discredit the whole, Refusnik movement, actually the whole dissident movement. So I was in the Washington bureau when he was released. I did fly to Israel when actually I flew to Berlin and tried to accompany him to Israel, but I couldn't, even though we knew Avital, his wife, very well in Israel. We were very good friends with her, but somehow I didn't connect with her because I'm sure she would have said, yeah, come on the plane, but we didn't, the communication didn't go through. So I went there first and then I flew to Israel. I was at Ben Gurion Airport when he landed, and I was on the tarmac, and there was a chain link fence between us. He came over to me and he said, "David, my co-conspirator," because apparently I was named, which I didn't really know, as a co-conspirator in the Soviet, indictment of him. So, and then I did a long interview with him, and every time I haven't been to Israel since 2014, but every time I go back, we get together. So, anyway.
When you were then, each time you would come back to New York, and then before you went to the next.
Yeah, well, between Moscow and Israel, it was a very brief time back. It was only, I think, a month or 6 weeks, something like that, which was vacation. But then the Times would bring me back for home leave periodically, even during an assignment, because they wanted to kind of touch base, introduce me to all the editors, get some ideas for stories and that sort of thing. So it was a good system.
Did the Times encourage you to write a book?
No, but they didn't object. I mean, I did ask for a leave to write the Russia book, but I was turned down because they really needed somebody in Israel. The correspondent there before me was moving to Cairo. So they had in fact, there was a little bit of a gap anyway, where they filled in with somebody or a couple of people. So they couldn't do that. But when I went back to Washington after Israel, I did get a leave for a year to write my book, Arab and Jew. And that was good because that was an intensive writing experience. I was at Brookings as a guest, what they call a guest scholar, which just meant they gave me an office, which was fine. And I wrote the book there. And it was.
Now, did you learn Hebrew?
I'm ashamed to say no. I was so busy. I did take Hebrew lessons when I first arrived in Israel, but I was so busy with both the book writing and the daily work for the paper that I found myself canceling lessons that my wife would then take in my place, not doing my homework, and also being contaminated by the widespread
Knowledge of
capacity of Israelis to speak English.
Yeah.
Unlike in Russia, so I could get
your
along.
Your Russian is good still?
To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends on what is. I would not put it in the present tense. I haven't used it in a long time. The last time I was in Moscow was 3 years ago.
So if you listen to a speech given by Putin, can you understand what he's saying?
Some of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't really tried recently.
Right.
You hear the beginning, and then there's the translator's voiceover,
Right.
so you don't really get a
Right.
chance to do it. I haven't really tried. I could probably, in the little bits that I hear, I can get some of it, but it's very rusty.
So do you think that 3-month strike hiatus sort of began your desire to do books?
I would say it facilitated my desire. I'm not sure that I think I probably would have wanted to do books anyway, because if you work for a daily newspaper in a country, there's a lot left over to say after you leave that you haven't gotten into the paper. So I think that I probably would have done it anyway. Honestly, I didn't know whether I could write a book. And I had the idea also was helped along by a literary agent in New York named Julie Fallowfield, who wrote to me, and I didn't know her, but she wrote a letter to me after I had done a piece on a picnic in Siberia. So I went out to Siberia, to Yakutsk in January, because I figured, well, if you're going to go to Siberia, that's the time to go, right? It was 40 below, literally. I don't know if you know this, but I learned it there. That's where centigrade and Fahrenheit coincide. Both 40 degrees below Fahrenheit is the same as 40 degrees below centigrade. And when I arrived, in fact, I traveled with the Washington Post guy, Peter Osnos, at the time. And when I arrived,
I know Peter from Brandeis, actually.
Oh, sure, yeah. So they had to roll out a jet engine on a trolley to blast hot air at the door of the plane to get it open. It was frozen. So we got there, and we asked, we always had a minder, a guide. These folks, though, were really quite different from the usual ones because they were way out, 7 time zones away or whatever. And Moscow was a distant apparition to them. One was worked for the Permafrost Institute, and another was the editor of the Communist Party newspaper or something like that. they said, what do you want to do? And we said, well, one thing we would like to do is to go out to the taiga, which is the pine forests that stretch for thousands of miles across Siberia. And they said, great, we'll have a picnic. So we had a picnic. It was about 20 below that day. No, the whiff of spring was in the air. But I wrote a little piece about this, 600 words, 700 words, and my agent loved it and wrote a letter. And she became my agent. She said, have you thought about doing a book? And you could do a book about Siberia. So I thought, a book, that's an idea. I didn't do a book on Siberia, but there it was. And honestly,
Did she remain your agent after for subsequent books?
She became my agent until she retired, and unfortunately she died just a few months ago. But she was wonderful. She was a real character in and of herself. She was British, and she had worked for MI6 during the war. So yeah, so she was something. She was great. I loved her. But she retired, and I went on to another agent and so forth. So anyway.
Yeah.
But, I think that, the first time you write a book, I mean, at least in my case, I didn't know there was going to be a book. And I had written a lot. And it was at some point, maybe midway through, maybe even more than halfway through, I suddenly thought to myself, I think that there is going to be a book. Because it's a very different occupation from writing news stories, very different.
Yeah.
And there are people who've been superb journalists for the New York Times who have tried to write books and have not been able to do it somehow for whatever reason. They just they just weren't. I think of Sidney Schanberg, who had this was a famous correspondent in Cambodia who stayed after the fall of Cambodia and was then expelled by the Khmer Rouge. But for a while, I mean, he wrote he did amazing coverage from Cambodia all the way through. And he never wrote a book about it, which he could have. I mean, he had it in his head. He just couldn't do it. Bill Keller, who was the Moscow bureau chief of the Times, I think he was bureau chief. Anyway, he became executive editor later. He tried to write a book. He took a leave of absence in Moscow, actually, after his stint ended, to work on a book. And it never materialized. Jim Markham, who was a brilliant correspondent I served with in Vietnam, was then in Spain and started to write a book, and he never was able to do it. So, and I'm not criticizing any of these people for not being able to do it. It's just a different métier. It's not the same kind of writing or the same kind of thinking. With a book, you have the great advantage of taking a fact, and instead of, disposing of it quickly as you do for a daily news story, you hold it up to the light, you examine it in all of its facets until you really think you understand it as well as you can. And that's a different kind of mentality, really.
Now, when you moved from being a New York Times reporter to not being a New York Times reporter, and for our listeners, David Shipler wrote something like 5 books. Seven books, but so 2 of them we've covered already.
Well,
so
we haven't
5 additional books.
We haven't really covered David's conclusions about the way the world works. And we're gonna get to that. Well, we're into more than an hour already, and we haven't even started.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But I just wanted to find out about how you moved from the Times to more being a full-time book writer.
Well, I was I after Vietnam, I went to Moscow, then I went to Jerusalem. I was in Jerusalem for 5 years. Came back, took a leave, wrote the book Arab and Jew, really got a taste for the long form. Then I joined the Washington Bureau, and I was chief diplomatic correspondent there, covering foreign policy in the State Department. But I really hungered for the ability to write longer stuff. And I decided I wanted to do something else. So I left the Times and went to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for a couple of years, writing about democratization, which was underway quite dramatically in what, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe. And so I wrote shorter pieces then for those 2 years. But then I began to understand that foreign policy was a little vicarious, that I really liked talking to people in the country where I was living. And since I was living in my own country, I wanted to come home and write about American problems. So I started with the most vexing problem that I thought we had, race, and did a book called A Country of Strangers, Blacks and Whites in America, which was actually, of all the books that I've done, I think the one that I found most interesting and illuminating to do, because I spent 5 years or so traveling around the country talking to Blacks and whites about their interactions across racial lines, concentrating on places where they came together: schools, colleges, workplaces, neighborhoods. There are not many of those, but there are some integrated places in the country and so forth. So I learned a tremendous amount and acquired lenses through which to see issues today that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's, so I just decided that that's what I really wanted to do. And then I went on to write a book about poverty, one of the other vexing problems in our country. And again, learned a tremendous amount. And then I'd always been interested in the law and in civil liberties. And I think that interest began during the McCarthy era, because I used to come home from school and see my grandmother sitting upright, stone-faced, watching television and the Army McCarthy hearings. And she was pretty conservative, but she detested McCarthy. There was something visceral about him, that her reaction to him. And I kind of grew up with that sensibility. And then in Moscow, of course, you see the opposite of what you believe ought to be the case in a constitutional system, such as, and you reflect on your own constitutional system. So that idea was kind of, in the back of my mind. And then after 9/11, I thought, well, there go our civil liberties. We're going to have to really watch ourselves closely before to not trample on a lot of people's rights. So I went about doing it. And, unfortunately for my readers, it ended up as 2 books rather than one, which could have, would have been, the one would have been so thick. And then I had a lot left over to say about freedom of speech. So then I did a 3rd book on that. And
well, let's turn. Tzvi is right. We want to get your sort of ideas about where we are. Tzvi, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, well, basically, what my question is, what have you learned about the world, and what's your outlook now, based on all of these experiences that you've had?
What a big question. Well, first of all, I have learned to try to get inside other people's minds to understand what's motivating them, because that's what I always found most useful as a journalist for the Times. That is, not just to report the surface, but try to understand what was happening. Whether I agreed with people or not didn't make any difference. I didn't feel Times readers cared a hoot about what Shipler thought about this or that. They wanted to know what was going on. And what goes on is not just what people say, but why they say it. Not just what they do, but why they do it. So in all of these cases, and particularly I'd say in the Soviet Union and Israel, where I had longer years to absorb those societies, I really made, I think, some inroads into understanding how the world looked from their perspectives. So when I look at the world now, I think about that a lot, not to exonerate or excuse behavior that's atrocious, but to explain or understand. So, for example, we now have Soviet troops massed on the border of Ukraine. Why are they doing this? Why is Putin up to this? Well, from my experience in the Soviet Union, I understand something about what we might consider the antiquated geopolitical viewpoint from Moscow, that the history of encirclement and foreign invasion is something that they still live with. Now, Americans, I think, are relatively ahistorical. We're not really steeped in history as deeply as many other cultures are. Now, some are imprisoned by history. In some ways, in the Middle East, I think a lot of people are imprisoned by history. In Russia too, and I think that is part of what's going on. Putin has seen, and I'm not excusing this, I'm just trying to understand what's going on. So Putin has seen since the fall of the Soviet Union, not only national humiliation, and let's remember that dignity is always a component of a country's or an individual's emotional outlook. We can never forget it. It's always there, and foreign policy hardly ever recognizes it.
Absolutely.
So the dignity,
even domestic policy,
domestic policy. That's right, exactly. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West took advantage. This is from the Russian viewpoint. The West took advantage of a weakness and a fall from the pedestal to expand NATO right to the borders of Russia, right to the borders. And that was alarming and infuriating. So the notion from Putin's standpoint, the notion that Ukraine might drift in that direction, even if it doesn't become a NATO member, becomes a kind of de facto part of the European sphere of influence and alliance, ignites this really long-standing, almost ancient Russian xenophobia. So that's one element. That's not the only thing going on, and I can't read Putin's mind. You asked me how my experience affects my view of the world. It's an example of how it has. Just having been there for 4 years and absorbed and I went back a bunch of times afterwards too, to do stories and stuff under Gorbachev, everything. I mean, just to absorb the kind of cultural prism through which they see the world. And I think that we in the West, institutionally, have not given that enough credence in shaping our own foreign policy. That's my feeling. And I honestly think things could have been different. I think that, I don't think you can turn back the clock very easily. I do think that the post-Soviet relationship with Russia, even under Putin, could have been a lot different from what it is now. If we'd been a little more,
if we had been more,
we can control only what we do. We can't control what they do.
Right.
So we have to look at what we do and figure out, okay, here are the variables. If we tweak this, if we do that, if we change that, will that have an effect that will benefit us? I mean, I don't think foreign relations are ever a zero-sum game. I mean, there are always overlapping interests. But sometimes it's seen as a zero-sum game. And I think certainly during the Cold War it was with Russia, with Soviet Union. I think now, to an extent, we've slipped back into that mentality where any gain for Russia is a loss for us and vice versa. And I think that's a dangerous way of thinking.
Now, let's conclude with your views now on sort of domestic policy, domestic issues, speech. The big ones are speech and race. So I don't want to put any words in your mouth.
Well, you and I've had a lot of conversation about this by email, so I don't mind talking about it. Look, first of all, let me just say one thing that's really important to say in this whole discussion, which is I think the American democracy is at risk. I'm obviously not alone in thinking that. I think that you have now what's coalescing into a movement on the extreme right, which uses the Republican Party as a conduit, which is setting out to undermine the electoral process. And I go back to my military experience on this, because I know from my military experience that when we did gunnery exercises with my destroyer, we did what was called bracketing. So you had an observer out there. You did shore bombardment. You have a target. Have an observer there. You fire around, it goes too far, and the observer radios to you down 150. So you do a little cranking and you turn it, closer 150 yards. You shoot again, the observer says left 50. So you do another adjustment and so forth until you hit the target. I think that's what the Republicans did in 2020. They tried to subvert the electoral process, and they found the vulnerabilities, or they found the strong points, actually. And many of the strong points were the local election officials who stood up for their duties and said, no, we're not going to distort the results. And that's where they're really going now. The voter repression or suppression is bad enough, but what's really dangerous, it seems to me, is their attempt to corrupt the mechanism of counting, and to obtain for Republican legislatures the right to, as they have under the Constitution, decide on the electoral votes, no matter what the public vote is. And that is extremely dangerous. It's also the other military analogy. I didn't witness this, but a friend of mine who was on an aircraft carrier was telling me they would launch aircraft, and and Israel does this too. It's a standard practice. They scream toward a foreign country's air defenses to light off all the radar so they can pick up the frequencies and codes and everything. And that's what the Republicans did in 2020. They picked up all the codes and frequencies so they could figure out how to combat them the next time around. I think American democracy is at risk. I really do. And part of my apprehension really does come out of my Soviet experience. I mean, I saw how a society works that pretends to have fair elections, and pretends to, and the propaganda and even the language, Trump's language, calling the press enemy of the people. I mean, that's Lenin's line. That's Stalin's line. Enemy of the people. I mean, oh man. I mean, that sent chills down my spine as soon as I heard it, because that's where a lot of the residents of the Gulag ended up, because they were declared enemies of the people. So that's the political part. On race and speech, it's the intolerance at both ends of the spectrum it's just so troubling and worrying, and it's part of the whole political problem, because you don't have, you might have most Americans willing to be open-minded and think and see shades of gray, but they're not, those aren't the people. They're not in power. Yeah. Those of us who think we're open-minded don't govern the situation. It's the extremes that do. The Post had a really interesting piece just the other day about a white teacher in a rural town in Tennessee who
read that.
Was fired. Did you read that? And what interested me the most about the story that this white teacher was fired because he talked about white privilege was the white students who gravitated to his course, conservative students who gravitated to his course or sought him out between classes to talk to him, to hear what he would say to what they were hearing at home or on the news. I mean, to me, that was encouraging. That means there were these kids who, wanted to engage these issues in a way that was, productive in terms of their own open-mindedness. So it's very worrisome. I mean, I don't know how, it's hard for me to tell, not being on a college campus, how widespread this cancel culture has become. Because I've, in past years, I would visit college campuses frequently to give lectures and teach for a week at a time. I did a week a year at one or another college, and I would ask the question, because I was interested in the free speech issue, And by and large, I mean, these were small liberal arts colleges for the most part. The kids and the faculty said, no, it's not really an
Not a
issue.
big deal, yeah.
So, but I don't know now whether that's changed. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
well, MIT had its recent, both Svi and I are alums of MIT, and
Mhm.
they had a recent episode of wasn't too desirable.
Well, I think
what can you say? What can you say that will end our interview on a more hopeful sign? I mean, you're a journalist, you call it as you see it, but former journalist.
There are an awful lot of really, if you're talking about the United States, I keep coming back to something that you said to me, Bob, when I was working on my poverty book, which I've quoted many times, which is, if there's a good idea, you can be sure somebody somewhere in the United States is trying it. I think that's true still. There are an awful lot of very good people who are trying to make this country better, not through antagonism and hatred and vilification, but through good works. And I am, I hold on to that, thinking, we're not so easy to defeat as an open society. We are pretty resilient in that way. We may go through hard times, and I'm not sure we're going to keep our democracy. I'm really worried about that. But ultimately, I'm not sure we can really be trampled. That's my hope. I know too many good people in this country who aren't going to take it lying down. So, one can hope.
That's I would say that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So you might have.
I don't know if you were to imagine a spectrum of pessimism versus optimism. On the optimism scale, I tend to read books by the optimists.
Are there any?
Pinker.
Yeah, Steven Pinker would be at the extreme of realistic optimists, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you place yourself?
That's a really good question. This is probably a bad day to ask me, because I just read this long piece in the Atlantic by Barton Gellman about the demise of democracy.
Yes.
So I'm not wildly.
I saw him interviewed on, I guess it was CNN today.
This is quite a piece. And then there's this book by Anne Applebaum called Twilight of Democracy. I don't know if you've read that. That's also,
no.
Well, she starts in Poland. She's married to a former Polish, I don't know if he was foreign minister or in the foreign ministry, but then she goes into, Western Europe and United States, and it's quite a well-reasoned and carefully thought out argument. And, she is a fairly conservative writer. So you're not just getting these alarm bells from the left, they're coming also from elsewhere. I would be more optimistic if I saw more Republicans who are responsible, finding a way to organize inside the party to try to reform. I'm really stunned, actually, by Trump's ability to mobilize affection or allegiance, maybe not affection, but allegiance.
I share that.
I'm really, it's the one
lack.
thing. Yeah, not much about Trump surprised me, frankly, because I watched him during the primaries and all up through it. But what surprised me was the Republican Party. I didn't think that he would be able to wrap them around his little finger.
What comes to mind, in my mind, with regard to the Republicans is Abraham's argument in the Old Testament with trying to save Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, name 10 honest men. And Abraham couldn't come up with.
Yeah.
And that's where the Republicans are now. I mean, where are the decent, upstanding Republicans?
It's so, what's distressing is the dynamic of fear. Even if you give some of them the benefit of the doubt and think, well, all things being equal, they wouldn't be doing this or saying this. They're afraid of losing their positions. That's a prescription for collaboration.
Yeah.
That's a prescription for the kinds of things we saw during World War II.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. I
and
totally.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm going to try to bring both of you back, at
Right.
least toward the
back to
middle
back
of
to
the
optimism.
spectrum. At least toward the middle
Maybe
of the
we'll see.
spectrum.
Maybe we'll see the emergence of a new political party.
Well, we
How's
are going to
that?
see the emergence of a scaled apprenticeship system that is supported by both Republicans and Democrats. So,
Well,
All
I was
right.
gonna, yeah, I was one thing I was gonna say. I know this is going on very long, but one thing I was gonna say was that the Republicans should be careful what they wish for. There's no divine order that the left can't be unscrupulous and corrupt as well.
yeah.
And one of the things that Ann Applebaum has written, not maybe in her book, but in an Atlantic piece, is a very good study of the action reaction dynamic of extremists. So you get this extreme right wing coming to the surface and finding its avenues into the political class. There's nothing to prevent that happening on the left as well. So that then we're really in the soup.
Yep.
And you can't expect corrupting the election corrupting process to just exist at one part of the political spectrum. I mean, look at gerrymandering. I mean, I live in Maryland, and we're, you know, we have a commission to redistrict, but the fact is that they're trying to gerrymander the one Republican member of Congress out of, you know, power by bringing in more Democratic voters. I mean, the Democrats do this. And of course, as you know, Maryland was one of the cases before the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to get into politics of gerrymandering. So nobody is Simon Pure here. And I think that's the danger, that this could really become quite corrosive to the democratic process generally.
Well, we'll all hope for the best. But meanwhile, I think we're going to have to sign off.
And you can take this up in your podcast where we left off.
Yeah, well, you know, actually, yeah, well, we probably will do something. Actually, we hope to have one about Eisenhower, because if you look back, I mentioned Susan Eisenhower's book. It's of course, it's the kind of book that you expect a granddaughter to write about her grandfather. He's wonderful and perfect. I would hope that one of my granddaughters would write such a book about me. Nevertheless, boy, you know, you can really feel nostalgic for that guy. Yeah, even if you're a liberal voter like me. Yeah. I mean, he was, you know, there was a lot of good stuff about him. And I wonder,
how about Bob Dole, who just passed away?
Bob Dole, you know, that's right. Yeah. I mean, these are, and John McCain, and, you know, these are people who are just, you know, not part of the mainstream kind of Republican movement. And
Richard Lugar from Indiana.
Yeah.
But
and Lugar, right,
exactly. Yeah, we'll have to sign off, and we sign off in a particular way. Zvi?
Yes, sei gesund.
Yeah, we say
which
sei gesund.
Means in both German and Yiddish, be well. Goodbye.
And thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks a lot.
All right. I'm going to stop here, stop recording.